So thank you all for those of you who have participated throughout these past 9 months in our various classes and various series and such. And it's been great to end on such a wonderful note here. So those of you who were not here for the 8 o'clock service also have Rabbi Panitz to look forward to in the pulpit this morning as well. So have that in mind. Without further ado then, with no other questions for me, Rabbi, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Father. No, that was going to be my line. I figured you expect him to say come to church. But if I said it, it might count for more.
Yes,
So friends, we've been on a journey. And we're on a journey in the reception of the stories of our Bible and how they impact our lives. And since we are historically conditioned, we live in this time, in this place, and not that time, in that place. Therefore, the story impacts upon us in a way that is specific, not only to the story, but also to who we are. And that's the guiding thought for all of us. Today, I'm going to show you 2 clips that really stand at the divide between 2 ways of receiving the Bible. In the first way, the Bible is important and impressive and significant and moving because it is larger than life. In the second way, the Bible is impressive and moving because it is humanized. So think about it. Some of you want Sir Thomas Beecham's orchestration of Handel with added trombones. And some of you want authentic Baroque music with a stripped-down orchestra, right? And the chamber feel. I'm not saying one is right and one is wrong, but different people can respond in different ways. So we're going to see 2 scenes of the same biblical story. The biblical story of the giving of the 10 Commandments, which is appropriate for the Sunday before Pentecost, which this is in the church calendar, because if you look at the 2nd chapter of the book of Acts, the first verse, I'm pitching an away game when I tell you this. You'll see that the disciples are gathered on the Hebrew festival day of Pentecost. And Pentecost, in the Jewish tradition, 50 days after Passover, is not only the wheat harvest, it was the wheat harvest going back to Stone Age times, but in the Jewish tradition, Pentecost is also the anniversary of receiving the 10 Commandments. So, playing this right now seems to be appropriate for the Jewish festival, and since the Jewish festival is the template for the Christian Pentecost, appropriate for where we are in our church here as well. So, I've studiously avoided Charlton Heston and Yul Brynner until now. Be responsible not to let you have at least a taste of it. So, roll on Jamie. We're going to start where Ramesses comes into the palace. Moses has just thanked God for closing the seas over the Egyptians.
Thou art God.
And that's how Moses talks in Demil. Okay, so Nefertari is sitting and waiting. Ramesses comes home. And take a look at what he proposes to do. He's just seen his chariotry been drowned. And remember, it was Nefertari who sent him out on this errand. He's not a happy camper.
Before you strike, show me his blood on your sword.
And of course there's none, because he failed. She sent him out to kill Moses, because for Demil it's a love triangle, start to finish. Now look what he says. Listen.
Is God. Is God.
Let's pause for a second. You might remember that in the silent film, when Pharaoh Ramesses is unable to get his God to revive his son, he angrily destroys the altar that the son had been laid upon. same filmmaker, DeMille, now using the resources of language, he has Ramesses himself acknowledge that his pantheon is composed of false gods. The God of Israel is God. And that's very important for DeMille to establish that. Ramesses should say it. And frankly, while that's not a direct quote from the Bible, that's in the spirit of God saying to Moses, I need the Egyptians to know that I'm God. A part of God's audience goes beyond the people of Israel. So I would rate this as not in the Bible, but the Bible worthy. Okay, now from that, we're going to skip a whole bunch of things. We're skipping the manna. We're skipping the war against the Amalekites. We're skipping the visit of Jethro. We're skipping Jethro teaching Moses how to delegate. DeMille's not interested in any of that. We go straight to this lovely painting, it's clear it's a painting, of Mount Sinai, and look how he portrays the actual giving of the Ten Commandments.
And Moses led Israel from the Red Sea into the wilderness of Sinai, and they camped before the holy mountain. And when the people saw that Moses delayed to come down out of the mountain, they gathered themselves together.
Okay, just pause for a minute.
Could anyone live on that fiery summit for 40 days?
Do you notice what he just skipped? Not only did he skip everything else I told you, he also skipped Exodus 19, when they gather at the mountain and Moses speaks to them and says, will you accept covenant with God? And they say, Na'aseh v'nishma, we hear, we obey and we hear. In other words, you don't even have to read us the fine print. We're already saying yes. And then chapter 20, God gives them the commandments. And then 21, 22, 23, God gives them the laws. And 24, and they ratify the covenant. And then at the end of 24, Moses goes up into the cloud where God was. Then you have details of the tabernacle, and then you have when the people saw that Moses had tarried in coming down, they began to murmur. For DeMille, all of that gets telescoped into this. Moses goes up, and immediately we have the discontented Dathan. Immediately. Because this was the point he wanted to make. He wanted to show as a juxtaposition Moses at the summit of spirituality, receiving the Ten Commandments, and down in the valley, the people wallowing in their orgiastic idolatry. He makes it so clear by skipping everything else and juxtaposing those two. So here we are. That's
249. Yes, by the will of God.
Who knows the will of God?
Do you? Do I? Or you, Sarah, his grieving wife? She came back among us to find a husband, but he's dead. Even she cannot hope that he lives.
Moses went up into the forbidden ground to receive God's law.
Yes, but he's not returned. We share your pain. We sympathize. But will sympathy lead us to this land flowing with milk and honey? Now we have to lead us, country fools!
So what happens is that Dathan effectively uses his demagogic skills to lead the people to a grave act of idolatry. They're going to have a visible God, and that is the golden calf. So let's see if we can't go with double time or 4 times.
Moses will return!
You'll get the idea of this. It's the same scene as you had in the side of the film. And let's go fast until we get to Moses on the mountaintop. By the way, you all know the actor Edward G. Robinson?
Oh, yeah.
He did a lot of heavies in his day, but he took this very seriously. At one point in the filming, someone was cutting up on stage, and he hushed them. He said, "We're doing God's work." He really, he had the villain's role, but he took it very seriously. Okay, let's stop here now.
Pure gold.
See that? That's
And Aaron fashioned it and smoothed it with the hammer, ready to be graven by cunning art and man's device. And he fastened it with nails that it should not move. And he that smote the anvil did beat the molten gold into thin plates, for they had gathered their treasure into the midst of the furnace, and did blow the fire upon it to melt it. And they adorned themselves in rich apparel and costly array, with veils of...
I just want to point out that 1956 Technicolor, they were really enjoying drenching the scene with color. So for us, this may seem like too much, but you got to realize that back in 1956, this was, oh wow, it's like, you know, double cheesecake with tiramisu on the side. Okay, let's go on.
Rabbi,
Yes.
why is it a calf? I mean, what's the significance of the calf? Why not a golden rabbit or a golden dog?
You know, I've thought about that a lot. The mother of, well, it could be a, no, I'm sorry, it could be a male. It's a bull calf. And in between the horns, you have the disc of the sun. So this is considered to be Ra, the father of Pharaoh. And so notice that they're not just taking any animal, they're taking one of the chief deities of the Egyptians as their iconic model. Because that's what God looked like to them. And the attempt to say in the second commandment, make no image of God, have no other gods, and also make no image of the true God, because any image of the true God is a subversion of the true God. Of nothing that is in the heavens above, or the earth down below, or the sea below the earth, nothing will do. So the attempt to make God visible is already the idolatry. DeMille does not try to soften that at all. We're going to see in the next movie that Aaron tries to say to them, this of course is not God, but this is your methadone. It's better than heroin. And this will get you. We'll see.
How about the Cornish hens?
It's all part of the celebration.
and purple and scarlet, and fine twined linen wrought in Egypt. And the women tread grapes from Midian into new wine.
Thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain. Remember to eat it holy.
So you get the sense of the juxtaposition. On the mountaintop, Moses is being exposed to this ultimate experience that transcends the limits of our sensory abilities, and the technology of the 1950s portrays it in the way that it was able to us it probably looks like I don't know, comic books or something like that, because we're used to more sophisticated computer-generated imagery. But if we could, let's go back to what it felt like to be watching that in the 1950s. And that's juxtaposed with the increasingly brutal and increasingly orgiastic worship down below. So let's fast forward until Moses comes down and is the immediate death of the party. We can just go fast through this. You'll see what's going on. It's a lot more of the same. DeMille was, of course, the master of the spectacle, cast of thousands.
And they really were thousands.
Oh no, literally. I mean, they couldn't just generate images. They double-checked the Hebrew with Professor Frank Moore Cross, one of the great Bible scholars of that era. And I myself learned how to read Paleo-Hebrew from this movie still. Because it's not the Hebrew that we learned, but I knew what the text had to be. That was my Rosetta Stone. That's how I learned Paleo. So Moses is now ready to come down. Somehow it doesn't look that heavy when he just totes it. He should have been straining more. If I were the director, I would call Charlton, make it look a little harder. Okay, here we go. Let's go at regular speed. Suddenly, people made me do it. That's fair.
He showed you no land flowing with milk and honey. I show you a God of gold. Come with
See
me.
the sun between the horns.
Blasphemers, idolaters, for this you shall drink bitter waters. God has set before you this day his laws of life and good and death and evil. Those who will not live by the law shall die by the law.
That's not the law. It's a great shot. DeMille just didn't give it to us. It's only given to us in the Ben Kingsley Moses, not in this next one either, where you have the Levites going over to the side of Moses and slaughtering their idolatrous brethren. There's actually a civil war ensued upon that, and in the Ben Kingsley Moses you have him beholding all of it and crying. Very, very powerful scene. That one, which we looked at last time, is probably the most accurate for in terms of trying to stay close to the Bible. So what do you make of Charlton Heston's Moses? I would say larger than life, right? He always declaims. 18 years later, the next attempt to do a story of Moses was in a different world. I want to submit that this is the post-disenchantment with Vietnam world. Post-disenchantment with authority figures, post-Watergate world. And what makes the Moses compelling to that later generation is not his superhuman likeness, it's precisely his humanity. So I want you to notice Burt Lancaster's portrayal of Moses in this next movie called Moses the Lawgiver. It was a mini-series, so it's a little bit choppy and episodic, but we're just going to look at the Mount Sinai scene to note the contrast. I also want you to note how in this instance the Ten Commandments grow organically out of the problems faced by the infant community of Israel. There's no sense of that in the biblical original, but it makes a lot of sense. Why those 10 laws rather than other 10? And if those 10 are responding to the initial missteps of the newly freed people, it makes a lot of narrative sense. So we're going to see that as well. So now we're into the second one. Let's pick up here.
The children of Israel dwelt in Egypt, where they grew and prospered. Now the Pharaoh of Egypt, fearing their great numbers, first enslaved them, and then slew the firstborn.
That episode, if you're just tuning in, you see Moses in the basket. You see him raised. Now you see the Exodus. Okay, here we go.
And impatient, Aaron, the brother of Moses, built them an effigy out of the gold of the treasury of the people. But the Israelites took this as a true god and worshipped it. They paid it tribute of song and dance and sacrifice. When Moses returned from the mountaintop, he looked with horror upon the sins of the people. He ordered that they assemble to be judged and to be punished.
So that's the synopsis of this scene. By the way, notice the music is quite different. The main theme was written by the movie composer Enrico Morricone, famous movie composer. But a lot of the music was written by an Israeli songwriter named Dov Seltzer, who was very active in the 60s and 70s. You'll notice that the music sounds, dare I say, Middle Eastern, or Semitic. And you'll hear some of the lyrics are Hebrew. So whereas the Israelites in the Ten Commandments by DeMille stand in for oppressed people anywhere, here you never forget sight that they are specifically Hebrews. And that's part of what's going on here as well. By the 1970s, we had many movements to reclaim not the homogenization of Americans, but the glorious quilt of our diversity. Right? Black is beautiful, the slogan of the 1960s. Puerto Rican and proud. I remember that from my New York City days in the early 1970s. And interestingly enough, when African Americans began loving their afro and letting it grow free, young Jews began wearing the kippah again. So there's a reclaiming of the ethnic diversity that makes up America. And of course you had Mr. Spock in Star Trek telling us that in our diversity is our strength. So that's also in the background of how this movie portrays the ethnic minority status of the Israelites in a way that DeMille never did. Okay, let's go on. He's broken the tablets. We have sound? Oh, sorry.
What you worship must be obeyed. What you took unto yourselves in the spirit, you must now take unto yourselves in the flesh. What you kissed, you must eat and drink. I have appointed officers of my own tribe of Levites. See that mouths that cried out in obscene ecstasy shall now cry out in a different manner.
As compared to the DeMille, there's brutality here, but there's pathos. DeMille has an earthquake transposed from the story of Korach in the book of Numbers, the rebellion of Korach, Numbers 16, Numbers 17, transposed to the Exodus story, and gets rid of the sinners by an act of God. Here, you see grieving relatives burying their own. As even a sinner could have been a loving brother, loving son, loving husband. See that? So there's an attempt to reconnect us with the humanity of this way of encountering the Bible story. Anyway, that's enough for now, and you have a kind of a pathetic scene.
Was it the same primitive Hebrew on there that was on the other one?
Yes, it's harder for me to make this out, to be honest. But here, you do not have the Ten Commandments destroying the golden bull calf.
Yeah.
Right? That's a DeMillian fantasy. What it says in the Bible is he cast them down at the foot of the mountain. So in that sense, this is closer. I believe that this particular film ought to be better known. Burt Lancaster in Moses the Lawgiver. It was a low-budget film, so the producers couldn't hope to replicate the high-cost, high-spectacle effect that DeMille had. So maybe driven by necessity, they opted to look for a different way to make it wonderful. So think about it. Not every melody needs symphonic treatment. Some melodies do best as chamber music. And I think that they've produced a chamber music version of the story of Moses rather than a symphonic version of the story of Moses. So I'm going to stop the video here and invite comments and conversation to show you that there's no one Moses for all time. There's no one Bible story retelling for all time. I can imagine that when my son preaches in Los Angeles, the concerns that are right in his generation, right in his place, are not identical to those that have animated me throughout my career. And I want these same stories to inspire him and to inspire his congregation, which means that my way of retelling them can never be perfectly adequate. It's enough if each of us engages the Bible in a way that transforms our lives. Then we have to leave it to God to allow God's classic stories to impact the next generation in their way too. So those are my closing remarks, but I do want to leave ample time for us to have a conversation. So you and I have shared so many good thoughts. Can I invite you to have a reflection? Would you like to take a minute and just share a thought of any of the many thoughts you've shared with me? I'll talk for you to me next.
Well, this has been very, very meaningful. Thank you so much. So I am focused on just a little piece, and it's graphic. So the calf, another way to look at the calf is there's the snakes in the shape of the crescent moon rising and waning, and the orb over it. So it could also be not only solar but lunar.
It could be lunar.
Yes.
And in fact, in the Mesopotamian pantheon, you have moon gods. Interestingly, we think of the moon goddess, we think of Luna as a feminine, right? Luna. O fortuna velut luna. Remember that from Carmina Burana? Right? However, in the Mesopotamian thought, the moon god was masculine. So it could go either way. By the way, what is so emblematic about the moon goddess? This is a very ancient religious notion. The slender crescent moon is like the pre-menstruating young girl. The full moon is like the matron, full of life. And the waning crescent is the postmenopausal crone who lays you out and takes your life, but the moon renews itself, so there is hope of resurrection. So the moon has been a religious symbol going all the way back to the Stone Age. And certainly it would never be surprising to see lunar iconography showing up here as well. Absolutely. Thank you. Feel free, want to share a thought?
Well,
and then it's open season.
I just noticed in the DeMille, and I do need to confess I'm not the biggest fan. The music when he throws the tablet at the cat, and the earthquake and everything. It's this scene of tragedy. The music's in major. It's interesting. It's really kind of
it returned to the main theme.
Yeah, but there's some irony there, and I think it's very intentional. And it shows a sort of, like you said a couple weeks ago, the then sort of American understanding of the Old Testament God as vengeful primarily.
Sure.
And the triumphant theme as these people are dying.
That's right.
Is kind of interesting.
No room for pathos.
No room for pathos.
But here, in the later one, you have room for pathos.
And I feel like every time I've seen the DeMille film, I sort of turned off to it for that reason. It just seems foreign to me.
Well, I must say, for me, the best way of taking DeMille is the silent film.
Yeah.
Because it's a little bit like, instead of 11 hours of a ring cycle, if you can get 45 minutes of the highlights, that's enough for me.
But I also was
I think that's what Samuel Clemens said about Wagner. I think Mark Twain said there's a couple of minutes of good music in there.
It's true.
No, I agree with you. The triumphalism of Charlton Heston's Moses
Right.
is a little bit off-putting to us, which tells us what generation we're in.
Right.
Although honestly, I know people today who are right there. Let me tell you about a building that I saw just over the Tennessee state line. I was driving to Knoxville this week as I was between Bristol and Johnson City. Anyone know that part of the country?
Okay.
So I saw a building that maybe you can help me understand. I think that this explains the phenomenon known as Christian nationalism. The name of the business was gunrunnersusa.com. I have to look it up, honestly. And then on the same building it said, Jesus is Lord. And I'm just reflecting on the juxtaposition of those two messages. I mean, you know I'm not a Christian, but I feel like Teddy, if I were a Christian. if I were a Christian, the various synonyms for Jesus that really speaks to my heart is Prince of Peace. Maybe some of you feel that way, and you are Christians. The Prince of Peace really speaks to me. If Jesus were packing heat, that centurion's ear wouldn't have been healed.
Right? Isn't that the story? That his disciple, is it Peter? Who was it? Peter slices off the guy's ear. If Jesus were packing heat, that guy would have ended up as Van Gogh. Or worse, right? But no.
Someone else might say, though, if Jesus were packing heat, he would be packing, and then they would name a particular type of manufactured gun. Like,
well, indeed they would. So, riddle your opponents like so many cheeses, or something like that. That's what they would have said. But I just don't understand gunrunnersusa.com juxtaposed with Jesus is Lord. But maybe that's the sensibility that really
so.
wants the Demillian touch.
I think so. My father is 77. He loves the later one. I don't understand it.
Well, let him see the earlier one. He'll love that too.
I would love for him to watch the
So there's a really wonderful writer. She writes a lot on Facebook, almost every day. Heather Cox Richardson.
Heather Cox Richardson. I'll look for her.
Yeah, one of her books. She's got another one coming. But her first book was How the South Won the Civil War. Yeah. And she makes a point about this indwelling need for Christ juxtaposed with the Calvary.
That's a very good point.
Yeah.
I also think that
Juxtaposed with what?
the cowboy, the Marlboro man,
Yeah.
tall in the saddle.
Yeah, John Wayne.
Yeah, John Wayne.
Come on, Pilgrim.
Now, think about this. Have you been to the Valentine Museum in Richmond? I was there this week for the first time. It was a very powerful experience for me. Frankly, I was waiting for the guided tour of the White House of the Confederacy to begin. And the docent told me that I should come back in an hour and a quarter. And I said, well, I'm parked here already. I don't want to try and find another place to park. Can you recommend what I can do for an hour and I'll come back? She said, well, the Valentine Museum is right up the block. So you know just where I was, right? And I saw the statue of Jefferson Davis that had been pulled off its pedestal in Monument Avenue. That's where it is now lying. It's broken. The arms are broken. It's been covered in multicolored toilet paper, pasted on. I know it's in an intentionally degraded position. And it's not standing, it's down. I had two thoughts. I thought of the statues of Saddam Hussein that were taken off their pedestal by Iraqis themselves who yearn for freedom. And I thought of the statues of Stalin knocked off their pedestals by Czechs and Hungarians and Slovaks and Poles and Romanians at the end of the Cold War, because they were so terrorized by what the Soviets, especially Stalin, had done to them. And then there was a set of sticky notes, and you were invited to write something and put it up on a column. So I read the sticky notes, and some of them were objecting to Jefferson Davis having been taken off his pedestal. And they said, don't try to erase history. And my response to that was, well, that's quite correct. And the model of Davis and of Stonewall Jackson facing north ought to be complete. There ought to be the slave market there too, which is what they were defending. They were defending not the slaves, of course, they were defending the auctioneers. If you want not to erase history, portray complete history. Right? But that's not what I wrote. I decided to write something in Hebrew, and if anyone could read Hebrew, they'd understand what I was saying. So I took Isaiah chapter 57, and I wrote 3 Hebrew words. Ein shalom lareshaim. For the wicked there is no peace. I just put that on the column. Maybe someday someone will come across this squiggle and figure out what's going on here. So that was my message in a bottle. So, sir.
I think there's a great significant difference between those destruction of statues that you first mentioned and then the end of it. The first ones were glorification at the present time of people who were there.
Quite correct.
And this is a memory of the past.
What I would like to remind you, this was an amazing factoid that I learned. There's a book about by Drew Gilpin Faust, I think is the name of the scholar, about the American response to the massive number of deaths in the Civil War, and how, as a nation, we needed to mourn. There had never been anything like this. 750,000 dead, of mostly the young people, both sides. And America needed to mourn, and so there were statues put up of the iconic soldier, Billy Yank and Johnny Red, in public parks, north and south. A decoration day, north and south, across the country. What I learned is that the same foundry in Massachusetts produced the statues of both armies. Did you know that?
Yes.
Isn't that something? And now, it's true, they were remarkably similar in their uniforms and their equipage, and no doubt, they fought with mostly the same weapons, and they had mostly the same uniforms, but to think that capitalism reigns supreme, the same foundry has cornered the market on Johnny Red and Billy Yank.
I think the only difference was the belt buckle.
I think so.
Yeah.
By the way, do you know what the Wehrmacht belt buckle was? Talking about Christian nationalism. Gott mit uns. Gott mit uns. God is with us. The Wehrmacht belt buckle. Even though Alfred Rosenberg, the theoretician of Nazism, gloried in atheism. Right? Our God is God of power, not the Judeo-Christian God of weakness and compassion. And yet, the Wehrmacht belt buckle is God with us. Now, I want to make a point about ecumenism that comes from that. There were a very few theologians in the evangelical Lutheran Church in Germany who dissented from the embrace of Nazism by that evangelical Lutheran Church. Some of them followed the theologian Karl Barth. You might know that name, B-A-R-T-H. Of course, he was in Switzerland already, so he was safe. He could afford to. And they signed something called the Barmen Declaration, which said Christianity cannot be put into the service of National Socialism. But most of the theologians in the German Lutheran Church in the 1930s made their peace with Nazism. Among those who didn't was a particular theologian who went to Rome, became Roman Catholic, and wrote a very different commentary on the Epistle to the Romans. This is the next scholarly project that I want to turn to. This commentary to the Epistle to the Romans looks at chapters 9 through 11, where St. Paul says, well, what shall we do about the Jews? And St. Paul comes up to the conclusion in chapter 11, we must never scorn them because we are the grafted on branch of the olive onto their rootstock. that became the key text for Vatican II in the 1960s, when they came up with the conciliar statement, Nostra Aetate, in our time, it is appropriate for us to pioneer a more positive relationship between, well, they said Roman Catholics, but more broadly between Christians and Jews. So it's interesting that a dissenter from the German Christian nationalism of the 1930s created the intellectual apparatus that later on became important for the ecumenical movement spanning the Jewish and Christian very closely. So that's a story that I want to work on and write at some point. But this notion of Christian nationalism being a subversion of Christianity ought to resonate with you, my friends, even more powerfully than it resonates with me. Mm-hmm. We have a couple more minutes, maybe another, yes, Father Vince?
Forgive me if you've already addressed this at some point. Would you say that the producers and maybe some of the actors in these various films, did they have an agenda other than to sell tickets?
Yes, they did. And it depends on which film. The agenda of the DeMille film was to have a conservative critique of Western secular culture, starting with the critique of the Jazz Age. The 1920s film explicitly says that secular culture led to the First World War and tens of millions of deaths. Now, as a historian, I would say other things led to the First World War, right? The balance of power created at the Congress of Vienna in 1815 got more and more creaky. Bismarck extended its life by moving the European countries into colonialism, a scramble for Africa, but sooner or later, that 1815 compromise just broke down, and so you had 99 years of aggression that were unleashed in 1914. That's not the same thing as saying secular culture produced World War I, but that was DeMille's vision of it. So the orgiastic scene at the foot of Mount Sinai is basically DeMille showing us 3,000-year-old speakeasies. 3,000-year-old Josephine Baker dancing bare-breasted, in Paris, so on and so forth. Who was it who had a bikini made of bananas? He's criticizing that. That's his agenda. I portray the 1951 David and Bathsheba as being a Cold War journey to faith. David starts off as a cynic, which the Bible doesn't portray him as a cynic, right? He's a sinner, not a cynic, right? And he ends up as a penitential, humble man of faith. At which point the drought ends, and the choir starts singing, "The Lord is my shepherd," and Bathsheba gets up from the edge of the bed where she was praying like a good Christian girl, right? And they walk out and watch the rain fall. Lovely Cold War myth, right? The 1985 David represents the anti-imperialistic agenda of Bruce Beresford, the filmmaker, who said that for him, David is the Cecil Rhodes of the Bible. Cecil Rhodes, the infamous British empire builder. You can't get much more programmatic than that. I believe that the Ridley Scott Exodus, Gods and Kings, is a response to the 2011 Fukuyama tsunami. We didn't have a chance to analyze that. If you want me back next year, I'll promise to do that. And the Noah from 2014 is about environmentalism. So they all have an agenda. Okay, well that's our time for today, but I so much enjoyed this opportunity to study with you.